It soon became apparent that France would fall, and so in Britain, plans began to be drawn up to evacuate the BEF back to the British mainland, so they could defend Britain from what now seemed like an inevitable invasion. Dubbed Operation Dynamo, a huge armada of fishing boats, pleasure crafts, and even rowboats were assembled on the southeast coast of England to make the trip across the Channel to Dunkirk, where the remnants of the BEF and elements of the surviving French and Belgian armies were assembling. In this small pocket of French coastline, the British and French troops at Dunkirk were surrounded by German troops and waited for either rescue, capture, or death. Hitler wanted to send his troops to wipe them out, once and for all, but the head of the German Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, convinced him that the Air Force, which had so far proved almost unstoppable, could smash them on the beaches with fewer losses to German forces. Göring hoped that by doing this, he would gain favour with Hitler over some of his rivals within the Nazi high command. The evacuation began on May 27, 1940, with a fleet of little boats bearing down on the beaches to take men out awaiting British warships. The German Luftwaffe launched a fierce aerial bombardment and inflicted painful losses on the British. However, for the first time in war, the superiority of the Luftwaffe was finally challenged, since Dunkirk was in range of fighters flying from Britain itself. The sea and sky thus became a brutal killing field until the evacuation ended nearly a week later on June the 4th, by which time a staggering 338,000 men had been rescued. The evacuation was seen as a victory for Britain, but those in the offices of power knew the truth. The defeat in France had not only cost the relatively small British army 68,000 men, but it had lost huge amounts of equipment such as artillery, tanks, and other assorted vehicles that would be vital in repelling a German invasion. Churchill warned against the optimistic mood after Dunkirk, noting that wars were not won by evacuations. In the wake of the success of the evacuation, a tragedy would occur that has been largely glossed over by history, when the British ocean liner, the RMS Lancastria, attempted to escape the French port of Saint-Nazaire. The liner was taking part in Operation Ariel, which aimed to evacuate British nationals from France, when at 10 minutes to 4 on June the 17th, it was bombed by German aircraft. Exact numbers of how many men, women, and children were on board is unknown, because in the chaos of the evacuation, people were crammed into every available space. But it's estimated that between 3,000 and 6,000 people were killed, making it the worst maritime disaster in British history. To put this into perspective, the most conservative estimates put the death toll as being twice that of the Titanic. The disaster was quickly covered up for fear of damaging national morale. On June 10, 1940, Mussolini waded in on the side of Nazi Germany, declaring war on Britain and France, although Italian forces would play only a token part in the fight for France. On June 25, 1940, after just 46 days of fighting, Hitler's troops achieved what the Kaiser had failed to do in 4 years, by defeating and occupying France. France was not wholly occupied by Germany, but instead the country was split in two, with Germany occupying the northern half and the south being ruled by the Vichy French government, who were essentially German puppets. The French surrender also gave Churchill concerns that France's fleet would be absorbed into Germany's navy and used to try and blockade Britain. In one of the most controversial acts during the war, on July the 3rd, he ordered the Royal Navy to demand the French warships at Melkabur in French Algeria to surrender to them, and when they refused, the Royal Navy bombarded them with shellfire, killing 1,297 French soldiers, and sinking or damaging 8 ships. With France dully suppressed, Hitler was now concerned with what to do with Britain. It wasn't in his favour to destroy them, as he believed that would only hand her empire to the Americans, who were becoming increasingly hostile to him after Poland. Believing Britain was spent after the fall of France, he sued for peace, but Churchill refused, even though he knew Britain's chances of repelling a full German invasion were slim at best. Hitler therefore ordered his generals to draw up plans for Operation Sea Lion, the invasion of Britain. At the same time, Germany, along with Mussolini's Italy, met with representatives of Japan to begin negotiations for an alliance that was meant to counter the United States. This ultimately culminated in the Tripartite Pact, signed on September 27, 1940, and saw the birth of what history now remembers as the Axis forces. Unlike Germany's previous military endeavours, the invasion of Britain had a serious obstacle in the way, namely the English Channel. Hitler's military leadership agreed that it would only be possible to cross the Channel in the summer, since the weather during the autumn and winter months would be too poor to cross safely. First, however, he would have to destroy Britain's air force, otherwise his troops would be sitting ducks to British aircraft as they sat in their invasion barges during the crossings. As Germany made their invasion preparations, Churchill readied the country to do what had to be done to defend themselves. Declassified documents show just how far he was prepared to go to repel Hitler's forces should they land in Britain. He ordered that British forces were to use chemical and even biological weapons at any German landing zone in Britain, frequently saying that it's our country and we can do what we want to defend it. On July 10, 1940, the German Luftwaffe began their offensive to destroy the RAF. It was the start of the Battle of Britain, and German confidence was still high after their swift defeat of Poland and Western Europe. However, unlike much of the fighting in Europe, the Luftwaffe now had to be content with a well-organised and highly integrated air defence network centred around the RAF's Fighting Command, led by Sir Hugh Dowding. They were equipped with two of the best fighter aircraft in the world at the time, namely the Hawker Hurricane and the more advanced Supermarine Spitfire. Fighter Command's ranks also swelled with an influx of British Commonwealth, French, Dutch, Polish, and even American pilots volunteering to fight with them, many of whom already had combat experience during the battles for their own countries. Over the coming weeks, the RAF would rise to face the overwhelming German aircraft, but they were suffering for it, as the Luftwaffe blasted their airfields in an effort to destroy their support infrastructure. On August 13, 1940, so many German aircraft attacked Britain that Churchill was warned that the invasion was finally underway. But despite a great deal of damage being done, the RAF was still holding out against the Germans, who were joined by the contingents of Italian aircraft. By September, Fighter Command was at its weakest point in terms of men and machines, but then British fighter production ramped up to the point where it outstripped losses and newly trained pilots began to join the fight. However, the damage to the airfields was proving more problematic. Hitler, on the other hand, was unaware that the RAF was once again growing in strength and was told by Göring that it was barely able to put any aircraft into the air. After British bombers hit targets in Berlin, in response to an accidental bombing by German aircraft of London, Hitler decided to order his bombers to turn their attention away from the airfields in order to devastate London and other British cities. His belief was that British morale would be so shaken by these terror attacks that the country would collapse, forcing Churchill to surrender, thus making an armed invasion unnecessary. It was a colossal mistake. Fighter Command effectively rebuilt and reorganised itself, and by the time Hitler realised his mistake, the summer was coming to an end. The weather was worsening, RAF Fighter Command was still a potent threat, and the country's defences had been built up to where it was no longer practical to invade. While the Germans had successfully captured the British Channel Islands, Britain herself was spared.